The United States has had a long and storied past relationship with opiates and general addiction and substance abuse issues. Much of the modern day drug problems faced by America can trace their roots back to the Civil War and the inventions that came along with it. Firstly, during the war, the traditional round musket ball was replaced by the newly invented French mini ball, the first mass produced bullet, which had the devastating effect of shattering bones on impact. Additionally, the bullets were made of lead, which increased the risk of infection and poisoning. This led to a major increase in the number of amputations on soldiers performed and the need for a strong painkiller. At this time, opium was the most common form of painkiller, although its prescription was rare and reserved for only exceptionally painful cases. It was during this time that the hypodermic needle was also invented, allowing opiates, usually morphine, to be injected and be more effective quicker. While morphine was needed to sedate soldiers during the extremely painful and gory process of limb amputation, its unregulated use, widespread availability in stores and catalogs, in combination with alcohol use caused a national opiate addiction crisis. After the war, disabled veterans found it difficult to find employment. With very few opportunities for women to be employed at this time, the wife and her children were left to rely on the man to work and provide for the family. Therefore, alcohol and drug addiction was an existential crisis for women and children. Because of the nature of the drugs being abused, economic hardship, disability, and social norms at the time, many women and children faced daily physical, verbal, and sexual abuse to the point many aspects of society were falling apart. For perspective, during this time, the average American drank 3 times as much as they do today. It was because of these factors and the solidarity among women and religious institutions that the women's suffrage movement gained real momentum and urgency. While the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave women the right to vote, was ratified shortly after the 18th Amendment, which began the prohibition of alcohol in 1919, women no doubt played a crucial part in its passage, especially given the fact that women in certain states at this point had been able to vote for the last 50 years, in the case of Wyoming, which began allowing women to vote in 1869, and is the reason why it's nicknamed the Equality State today. The turn of the 20th century also began to saw the first national sale of branded beverages, most notably Coca-Cola, which derived its name from the fact that the drink contained cocaine from the coca leaf. A small cocaine addiction also occurred during this time, but legislation and the banning of coca leaves put an end to it for several decades. So while prohibition may have succeeded in ending the opioid crisis at the time, many new waves of urban-dwelling European immigrants would not have it with the prohibition of alcohol, and by 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed and alcohol was again legal in the United States, but only after creating the first real system and demand for organized crime, which persisted after prohibition. In the decades that followed, drug and alcohol use remained relatively low, with a few exceptions, including the temporary rise in prescriptions of benzodiazepines and muscle relaxers, among other pills. Conservative mainstream society was most preoccupied and worried by the use of cannabis and psychedelics among their baby boomer children, which in reality proved to be mostly harmless, with fears of reefer madness being unfounded. In the 1960s, Cuban exiles escaping communism began arriving in Miami by small boats due to a rule that granted Cubans instant citizenship if they arrived on U.S. soil. Many of these exiles were passionate about their cause and seek to earn money to fund anti-communist activities in Cuba. They began to reintroduce and traffic cocaine from the Colombian producers, who in turn obtained the coca leaves from predominantly Chile. Following the 1973 Chilean coup and the rise of the right-wing government of Augusto Pinochet, a crackdown occurred, and Chilean cocoa production was severely disrupted. This forced the Colombian producers to begin to cultivate their own coca crops in Colombia directly and to consolidate their trade, increasing the size and importance of the illegal business for them. To circumvent the Cuban traffickers, Colombian cartels purchased entire islands in the Bahamas and built small private airstrips so that they could fly plane loads of cocaine to the east coast of the US. It is at this point that I want to make the observation that humans have the tendency to seek an altered state at times through the use of substances. There does not seem to be a real rhyme or reason as to what substance that happens to be, other than the addictiveness and availability of the drug at a given time. Drug users also tend to do the same drugs that others around them are doing in an effort to normalize their behavior. In the 60s, smoking marijuana and trying LSD was almost a rite of passage for young university students who were doing something that they knew their parents despised. People becoming adults in the 70s and 80s similarly wanted to be different than their parents and had a greater emphasis on partying and discos, and the newly readily available cocaine became synonymous with the scene. It wasn't until the Vietnam War and the physical and mental pain and suffering that the soldiers who fought in it were forced to endure that there again began to become an uptick in the rate of opiate abuse. The drug heroin was widely found in Vietnam and the rest of South Asia at this time and found its way into American soldiers' habits to the point where it was estimated that 15% of all soldiers stationed in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. At the start of the 1970s, the Nixon administration was tasked with the gradual withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam and began to become acutely aware of the drug addiction crisis that was beginning to form. This led to the passage of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, with Nixon officially declaring a war on drugs. While the war on drugs is seen today as a costly failure, the first bill was not all bad and essentially had two parts. First, it required pharmacies to secure and track their medications in an effort to stop pilferage. Second, it set up a drug classification system that placed different drugs into schedules based on their medicinal value and danger of use. Unfortunately, this system is incredibly rigid and it's difficult to change. Nixon also had a personal fear or dislike of marijuana and posited that it was a gateway drug, which explained to him why soldiers were coming home addicted to heroin. The placement of marijuana as a Schedule I drug, the worst rating, and the penalties of possession and distribution that come with it caused a major spike in the incarcerated population, especially among Black males due to the avoidance of marijuana by whites at the time. By the 1980s, greedy businessmen within the Colombian drug trade began to overproduce, causing a large overstock to sit unsold in the Bahamas, and which sent cocaine prices falling. These cartels made the decision to convert the cocaine into crack by freebasing it with baking soda so that they could sell a new product independent of the supply and demand of powder cocaine. The cocaine trade, which utilized small planes to ship the drug, always relied on selling it in concentrated and dense urban areas so that the drug could be sold quickly and cheaply. During the Reagan administration, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 was passed and continued the war on drugs. The law had three main provisions. In order from good to bad, they are, firstly, it increased penalties for crimes that were committed with a firearm. Second, it began to allow law enforcement departments to begin to seize assets related to organized crime and pocket the illegal profits to help fund their department. Lastly, it created a federal system for mandatory minimum sentencing with increased punishments for marijuana usage. This last provision was responsible for the explosion in incarceration rates in the 80s and 90s. By the mid-80s, white flight from the city centers left Black Americans the predominant urban dwellers and thus the primary customer for Colombian dealers of crack cocaine. The sudden wave of addiction and crisis that hit urban America because of crack scared many white Americans and reinforced the idea that crack was the worst of all drugs. This demonization of crack and its users is clearly shown in the sentencing disparity between powder and crack cocaine, with the latter being more severe by 80-to-1 ratio. Going into the 1990s, many Americans were looking for a substance that could improve their mood and general pain without using something considered unsavory, such as marijuana or cocaine. The introduction of the antidepressant Prozac in the general category of SSRI drugs caused a new wave of prescriptions for average people wanting relief from chronic depression or OCD. While the efficacy of SSRIs have been called into question, the dangers and risk of abuse are quite low, and they have undoubtedly helped many people with a variety of psychiatric issues. The same cannot be said for prescription opiates. At this time, doctors knew the stories of the past quite well and were well aware of overprescription of opiate morphine that had led to a full-on addiction crisis only 100 years earlier. Pharmaceutical firm Purdue Pharma, the inventor of OxyContin, was up to the challenge of changing doctors' minds on the potential uses of opiates for pain relief and spent the entire decade waging a national PR campaign to convince doctors that the pill form of OxyContin made it much harder to get addicted to than injectable morphine. Purdue would be considered a boutique pharmaceutical company focusing on pain management, with this specialization probably only occurring due to American demand for quick and easy medical fixes, in contrast to traditional care, which is much more expensive under the U.S. health insurance model. The problem was a slow burn, but the signs of addiction began to be felt in New England and Appalachia in the 2000s. Regional differences in demand helped support the idea that Purdue was instrumental in the marketing of OxyContin and opiates in general, most clearly shown in Appalachia. Purdue sales reps had a focus on Appalachia due to the relative isolation and poverty of the region. Most general practitioners operated out of a single office, serving a small, often poor community, meaning that the doctors were also poorer than the average doctor in the U.S. Purdue sales reps bribed these doctors into prescribing oxy-like candy to the local population under the guise it was a healthy solution to whatever acute or chronic pain one might be facing. Starting in 2010, government and law enforcement began to crack down on the overprescription of opiates, and many in the medical community, now aware of the widespread dangers, began to stop prescribing them only for especially painful situations. This sudden drop in availability caused many normal people who were secretly addicted to opiates began to crave them. Dealers started the sale of heroin once again to fill this void with a cheaper, more readily available drug. Widespread use of opiate prescription pills is known as the first wave of the crisis, while its replacement with heroin is known as the second wave. Some 80% of the global supply of heroin originates from poppy fields in Afghanistan, which at this time was unstable from an American invasion, with the government being held together by the occupying American forces. During American occupation, poppy cultivation greatly increased due to the lack of a central government. Thankfully for countries around the world, when the Taliban came back to power after the withdrawal of the US, they have made a huge effort to end the Afghan opium trade, which they believe goes against the central tenets of Islam. Starting in 2013, following large-scale crackdowns on the heroin trade, dealers began to add synthetic adulterants to cut costs, chiefly by using fentanyl, an extremely potent synthetic opiate. Most fentanyl flows in the US by being synthesized in China, shipped to Mexico, and then trafficked over the border. While the Chinese government has agreed to help stop the flow of fentanyl from their factories, it wouldn't be inconceivable for them to be indifferent about the issue because of the past history of the British and the rest of the West purposefully using opium to subdue the Chinese population in what was known as the Opium Wars. Additionally, healthcare workers with access to fentanyl supplies within hospital systems have been caught stealing the drug despite previous anti-pilfering laws, since even microdoses can be diluted, creating many, many doses. As of 2023, we have begun to see fentanyl be cut with even more adulterants, such as xylazine, or taken in conjunction with another more widely available drug, increasingly cocaine or meth. This makes sense because of the large recent corporate investment in drug monitoring and security. The supply of opiates in general has become more expensive because of the succession of countermeasures we have taken. Most importantly, new waves of opiate addicts are not being created, as doctors are no longer prescribing them for most cases. It is my hope that the litigation against Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family will continue, and that they will be financially ruined, as to send a message to other drug companies that they cannot profit from the addiction of our citizens.